The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the sound of raised voices or the sight of uniforms. It was the image of my husband, Marcus, being shoved against the hood of a black SUV parked crookedly by the lake, his arms twisted behind him as if he were some criminal caught red-handed. For a split second, my brain refused to process it. Marcus? In handcuffs? He had done nothing wrong. He was just out for his evening walk along the lakeside like he did almost every day. But then the words shouted by the so-called officers sliced through the air. "You're under arrest for trespassing under HOA law." The phrase was so absurd it left me breathless. HOA law? Since when did homeowners associations have the power to arrest anyone? And since when did they dress in full uniforms with fake badges gleaming under the setting sun? Neighbors began spilling out onto porches, peeking from behind curtains, phones in hand, trying to capture the spectacle. To them, it must have looked like Marcus had actually been caught in some serious crime. But I saw it differently. I saw the smug face of Karen, our overbearing HOA president, standing behind the two uniformed men with a self-satisfied grin, as if she had orchestrated the entire scene just to humiliate him. My stomach dropped. Karen wasn't just harassing us with petty rules anymore. She had escalated into full-blown impersonation of law enforcement. Marcus, calm as always, protested in his steady voice, demanding to see a warrant, questioning their authority. But his reason only seemed to fuel Karen's arrogance. She announced loudly, so all neighbors could hear, that Marcus had been caught violating HOA security ordinances by walking along the private lakefront without clearance, and that the HOA had upgraded its enforcement arm to deal with repeat offenders like him. Her words echoed with false authority, but many of the neighbors, already used to her bossy tone, began nodding as if she spoke the truth. The more she talked, the more the performance grew, and the men in fake uniforms tightened their grip on Marcus as though they were real officers carrying out a legitimate arrest. But here's what Karen didn't know. She was making a catastrophic mistake. Because Marcus wasn't just any man. He was a former detective who knew the law inside out. And I wasn't just his wife. I was a federal agent with direct ties to the FBI. I could spot a counterfeit badge, a forged ID, or a sham arrest a mile away. From where I stood, I could already see the inconsistencies. Their badges were dull pressed metal, nothing like the real thing. Their handcuffs were cheap training-grade knockoffs. The SUV they pushed him toward had magnetic decals reading Community Patrol that looked as though they'd been ordered online. This wasn't law enforcement. This was theater. And Karen was the director. The anger in me boiled hotter with every passing second. The sheer audacity of Karen to drag my husband into this humiliating scene under false pretenses was beyond anything she had done before. This wasn't her usual passive-aggressive notes about lawn height or garbage bins. This was impersonating federal authority, a crime so severe it would land her and her accomplices behind bars for years. And the irony was delicious. In her attempt to destroy Marcus, she had stepped right into the jaws of the very justice she thought she controlled. But Karen's arrogance blinded her. She strutted closer to Marcus, raising her chin as if she were a queen issuing royal decrees, barking at neighbors that Marcus was a repeat violator who thought he was above HOA rules. She wanted the whole neighborhood to see him in cuffs, wanted whispers to spread, wanted him branded as a troublemaker. The neighbors whispered exactly as she intended, but their eyes betrayed confusion. Some weren't convinced. Some frowned, murmuring to each other, wondering when the HOA gained authority to arrest anyone. The seed of doubt was there, and that was all I needed. Marcus turned his head slightly, locking eyes with me from across the lawn. His look was steady, calm, but it wasn't a plea. It was trust. He knew I wouldn't let this go unanswered. That silent communication gave me clarity. This wasn't just an embarrassing stunt. It was an opportunity. An opportunity to expose Karen's corruption, to show every neighbor exactly who she was, and to end her reign of terror over this community once and for all. My hands itched for my badge, for the authority I carried but rarely flaunted. But I knew timing was everything. If I rushed in too soon, Karen would spin it as me overstepping, as a wife hysterically defending her guilty husband. No, I needed to let her dig her hole deeper, let her accomplices parade their fake power a little longer, until the evidence stacked so high against them that no one, not even Karen, could deny it. As the men shoved Marcus toward the SUV, Karen lifted her phone and pretended to log the arrest, muttering about evidence and violation reports. Her smug smile widened when she saw a neighbor's recording, as though she'd finally claimed victory. But she had no idea that those very recordings would soon become evidence. Evidence of her impersonating officers, orchestrating an unlawful arrest, and parading around in costumes that mocked real authority. The spectacle had only just begun, but one thing was certain. Karen had crossed the line. And by the time I was finished with her, the whole neighborhood would know the truth, that the self-proclaimed enforcer of order was nothing more than a criminal hiding behind a fake badge. Karen's little performance grew bolder by the minute, her voice carrying over the water like a judge sentencing a criminal in a packed courtroom. The fake officers pushed Marcus against the SUV, their movements uncoordinated but forceful enough to convince anyone who wasn't paying attention that this was legitimate law enforcement in action. Karen strutted like she had staged a grand victory, her phone raised high as if documenting a historic moment of neighborhood justice. She kept calling attention to Marcus as though he were some dangerous intruder rather than a man peacefully walking near his own home. The neighborhood audience swelled, people stepping out of their houses, some even walking closer, eager to witness the spectacle. Karen thrived on their eyes, basked in their whispers, and relished the illusion of control. Yet beneath her facade, cracks were forming. I saw neighbors whispering more urgently now, their brows furrowed, their phones capturing every detail, their suspicion growing with each inconsistency. A few exchanged knowing glances as they noticed the cheap shine of the fake badges, the SUV's mismatched plates, the awkward way the supposed officers handled Marcus like amateurs who had never received proper training. Marcus, despite the pressure of the cuffs and the eyes of the crowd, carried himself with the same composure he always had when faced with injustice. His calm presence only highlighted the absurdity of the situation. Where Karen wanted to paint him as reckless and dangerous, his steadiness made her performance look hollow, desperate. I watched as he scanned his surroundings, his detective instincts never truly dormant. He was calculating, observing the crowd, the men restraining him, the little details Karen overlooked in her arrogance. It was a silent reminder to me that we were not victims of her scheme. We were merely letting her expose herself in public view, giving her all the rope she needed to hang her own credibility. The longer the fake arrest went on, the more neighbors began murmuring their doubts. Some asked aloud when the HOA had been granted power to detain residents. Others questioned why real police had not been called if Marcus had broken an actual law. But Karen, fueled by her need for control, brushed off the skepticism, declaring loudly that the neighborhood was under threat and that she had taken the necessary steps to keep everyone safe. Her tone was sharp, commanding, and dripping with arrogance, but her arguments were weak, stitched together with fabricated authority. Instead of silencing doubt, she was amplifying it. Every lie she spoke became another thread unraveling in front of the community. Meanwhile, I kept my stance still, my pulse steady, my mind moving like a chessboard. Timing mattered. If I stormed in too early, she might still sway some of the impressionable neighbors into believing her version of events. But if I waited just long enough, the community would see for themselves the farce unraveling before their eyes. Already, I noticed a few neighbors edging closer to the SUV, their phone cameras raised, zooming in on the badges, on the poorly sewn patches, on Karen's manic expression as she barked orders. What she believed was a public humiliation for Marcus was becoming a public record of her own downfall. I watched as one of the fake officers fumbled with the radio clipped to his belt, pressing buttons that produced only static, no actual dispatch calls, no coded language like a real officer would use. Marcus tilted his head slightly, catching the error, his lips curving into the faintest ghost of a smile. He knew, as I did, that these men were digging their graves deeper with every mistake. Still, Karen tried to control the narrative, instructing the crowd that Marcus was a repeat violator and that she had escalated enforcement because the neighborhood deserved safety. It was the same fear tactic she had always used with her memos and threats, but now magnified into a dangerous spectacle. She wanted neighbors to believe that only she could protect them, that only she had the power to keep order. But in her desperation to play the hero, she was becoming the villain in everyone's eyes. The SUV's engine rumbled as the imposters prepared to shove Marcus inside, another sign of their incompetence flashing bright to anyone watching. Real officers would have called in backup, followed procedure, and respected constitutional rights. These men were improvising poorly, and with each move, they exposed themselves further. My mind cataloged every detail, the cheap cuffs biting into Marcus's wrists, the fake insignia stitched unevenly on their sleeves, the hollow clunk of the SUV door when one of them yanked it open. Each flaw was another piece of evidence I would use against them when the moment came to strike. As the performance dragged on, the atmosphere shifted. What began as curious spectatorship became uneasy suspicion, and suspicion soon turned into quiet resistance. Neighbors whispered more boldly now, some even stepping closer to challenge Karen's claims. One elderly man shook his head in disbelief, muttering that this wasn't how real law enforcement behaved. A mother pulled her child closer, whispering that something didn't feel right. The doubt was spreading like wildfire, undermining Karen's authority with every passing moment. And she knew it. I saw her jaw tighten, her smile falter, her eyes dart nervously toward me as though she sensed that her perfect performance was unraveling in front of the very audience she sought to impress. The irony was thick. Karen, the self-proclaimed protector of the neighborhood, had staged her grandest performance yet, only to reveal herself as a fraud before the eyes of those she tried to control. And the best part was, she didn't even realize how close she was to collapse. With every step she took, she was marching toward her own destruction, and I was there to make sure the fall would be final and unforgettable. The moment the fake officers tried to shove Marcus into the SUV, the fragile illusion they had built began to collapse under its own weight. Their movements were clumsy, their hands slipping on the cuffs as Marcus deliberately resisted just enough to force them to reveal their inexperience. Instead of looking like professionals in control, they looked like amateurs grappling with someone far stronger and calmer than they were. The neighbors, who had been murmuring in confusion, now shifted into open doubt. Phones were raised higher, cameras zoomed closer, voices whispered louder. What was supposed to be Karen's triumphal display of authority was morphing into a public trial of her credibility. She barked at the crowd that this was official HOA business, her voice cracking with strain, her once smug posture now stiff with desperation. The more she insisted, the more ridiculous she sounded, because everyone could see the inconsistencies. Real officers did not drive unmarked SUVs with magnetic stickers. Real officers did not stumble over handcuff procedures. Real officers did not answer to the orders of an HOA president. Marcus kept his composure, letting the scene unravel around him. His quiet strength stood in sharp contrast to Karen's frantic theatrics, and the crowd noticed. Neighbors began exchanging knowing looks, some whispering that they had long suspected Karen of going too far with her power trips. A few even started voicing their doubts openly, their words carrying across the lawn like cracks spreading across glass. Karen's eyes darted nervously between them, her confidence slipping as she realized the spectacle was no longer under her control. She raised her phone higher, shouting that she had evidence, that she was doing what no one else had the courage to do, but the tone of her voice betrayed panic rather than authority. She had planned to humiliate Marcus, but now she was the one on the verge of humiliation. I stood a few paces away, my heart steady, my instincts honed. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Karen was deep enough into her charade that backing out gracefully was impossible, and the imposters she had recruited were exposing themselves with every clumsy action. My badge rested against my side, cool and heavy, a reminder of the authority I carried. But still I waited. Timing was everything. Letting Karen burn through her last scraps of credibility in front of her neighbors would ensure that when I revealed the truth, there would be no room for her to twist the story. She had built this stage herself, and I intended to let her collapse on it in full view. The imposters yanked the SUV door open and tried to shove Marcus inside, but he planted his feet firmly on the ground, his strength immovable, his presence commanding. One of the men muttered something about calling headquarters, fumbling with his radio, which only produced static. That single detail caught the neighbor's attention like a spark catching dry grass. Real law enforcement radios connected instantly. They didn't sputter and crackle like cheap walkie-talkies. The whispers grew into bold statements now, voices questioning why real police had not been called, why Marcus was being treated like a criminal for simply walking by the lake, why these men seemed so unprofessional. Karen snapped back at them, her voice shrill, demanding that they trust her, insisting that the HOA had been forced to establish its own enforcement because the police had failed to keep order. But her excuses rang hollow. Instead of silencing doubt, they magnified it. The more she spoke, the more her lies unraveled. The tension in the air was thick, every second pulling the noose tighter around Karen's neck. She was too arrogant to see it, too blinded by her obsession with control. I studied the crowd, noting how their expressions shifted from confusion to suspicion, from suspicion to anger. They were realizing they had been manipulated for years, that Karen's self-proclaimed authority had been built on intimidation and lies. What they were witnessing now was not Marcus being arrested. It was Karen revealing herself as a fraud. And soon, the weight of the law would come crashing down on her. I moved closer, my steps measured, my presence calm but undeniable. The imposters glanced at me nervously as I approached, their confidence faltering, their hands tightening on Marcus as though afraid of losing their only grip on the illusion. Karen saw me too, her eyes narrowing, her jaw tightening, as if she suddenly remembered who I was and what I represented. She had always underestimated me, assuming I was just Marcus's quiet wife, someone she could push around with her petty rules and fabricated authority. But now, with the whole neighborhood watching, she was about to learn the truth. The SUV door slammed shut as the imposters tried one last time to force Marcus inside, but his resistance and their incompetence turned the attempt into a farce. Neighbors gasped, phones recording every second, their voices rising in protest. Karen screamed that Marcus was resisting arrest, her words shrill and desperate, but by now her performance had lost all credibility. The scene no longer looked like law enforcement in action. It looked like a staged kidnapping in broad daylight. The irony was complete. In trying to portray Marcus as a criminal, Karen had painted herself as one instead. The time had come. I reached for my badge, my decision made, my resolve unshakable. Karen had wanted a spectacle, and she had gotten one. But the ending would not be hers to write. With the neighborhood gathered, with every camera recording, and with Karen's lies exposed in real time, I was ready to reveal who I truly was and end this charade once and for all. The final act of Karen's charade came crashing down in a way that was both inevitable and unforgettable. I stepped forward into the center of the crowd, the weight of the moment pressing against my chest, and pulled out my badge with deliberate precision. The metallic glint caught the fading light and instantly silenced the murmurs, replacing them with sharp gasps as neighbors realized what they were seeing. The imposters froze mid-motion, their hands still gripping Marcus but their confidence draining like water through a sieve. Karen's face, which had been locked in smug determination all evening, shifted instantly into something jagged and brittle, fear mixed with disbelief. She had spent years lording herself over this neighborhood, fabricating authority, manufacturing rules, and now, in a single gesture, she saw her empire collapse. I spoke calmly but with the authority that came with years of federal service, making it clear to every eye and every recording phone that the men laying hands on my husband were criminals impersonating officers, and that Karen was complicit in orchestrating the unlawful detainment. The weight of those words cracked the performance wide open. Neighbors who had been hesitant now erupted into outrage, voices rising in protest against Karen, their trust shattering in an instant. The imposters reacted like cornered animals, their grip on Marcus loosening as panic overtook them. They had walked into this stunt thinking it was a simple intimidation job, a favor for a domineering woman who promised control over the neighborhood. But they hadn't expected to be exposed by someone with the authority to bring federal charges crashing down on their heads. Their faces drained of color, their bodies stiff with dread, as they realized that every second of their impersonation had been caught on camera by dozens of witnesses. They were not enforcers anymore, they were evidence. And the evidence was damning. Karen, however, still clung to denial, her voice rising in hysteria as she tried to twist the story, shouting that she had done this to protect the community. But her words bounced off a wall of disbelief. No one listened anymore. The neighbors who had once reluctantly bowed to her authority now saw her for what she truly was: a fraud, a bully, and a criminal. Marcus straightened his posture as the fake cuffs were removed, his calm presence amplified by the chaos unraveling around Karen. He didn't need to gloat or say a word. His composure in the face of humiliation had already turned the tide of opinion against her. The crowd no longer saw him as a violator of some fabricated ordinance. They saw him as the man who had endured her staged assault with dignity, the man who had quietly exposed the truth by letting her spectacle collapse on itself. And with me standing at his side, badge in hand, the entire neighborhood now understood that Karen's reign was over. She had not only broken the fragile trust of her community, she had violated real laws, laws that carried weight far beyond her petty HOA bylaws. What followed was swift and undeniable. The imposters were restrained, their fake uniforms confiscated, their pathetic attempt at law enforcement stripped down to nothing more than costumes. Every detail of their sham, the cheap badges, the static-filled radios, the mismatched SUV, was logged and documented, pieces of a puzzle that spelled out a conspiracy orchestrated by Karen. Neighbors who had once feared her stepped forward eagerly to provide witness statements, their pent-up frustration spilling into angry recounts of her years of intimidation and harassment. For the first time, voices that had been silenced by her threats rose freely, each testimony another nail in the coffin of her credibility. Karen herself was cornered, her hysteria boiling over into desperate excuses, but no one stood with her. Not one neighbor came to her defense. She had built her authority on fear, and once the fear was gone, she stood utterly alone. The irony was impossible to ignore. Karen, who had spent years pretending to protect the neighborhood from imagined threats, had become the very threat she claimed to guard against. She had weaponized fear, twisted rules, and dressed up imposters in uniforms to play at power, only to be unmasked in front of everyone by the very people she sought to dominate. Her downfall wasn't just legal, it was social. The neighbors who once avoided her gaze now looked her in the eye with contempt. The neighborhood that had been under her thumb now rejected her entirely. And the humiliation of being exposed in public view, surrounded by the people she had tried to control, was punishment deeper than any fine or sentence could provide. As the imposters were taken away, and as Karen herself was restrained under real authority this time, I looked around at the crowd and saw something shift in their faces. It wasn't just relief. It was a newfound unity, a realization that they had been manipulated for too long, and that the spell had finally broken. For the first time, the neighborhood felt free. Karen's fall was not just the end of her tyranny. It was the beginning of a community no longer bound by her false rules and intimidation. The lakefront that had been declared off-limits was once again open, the streets no longer patrolled by her empty threats, and the atmosphere no longer poisoned by her need for control. Marcus and I stood together, not needing words to mark the victory. He had endured the humiliation with patience, and I had brought the truth into the light with precision. Justice had been served, not just in the form of charges and arrests, but in the cleansing of a community long held hostage by one woman's arrogance. Karen's downfall was total. She had lost her power, her allies, her reputation, and her freedom, all in one night. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the lake in shades of fire and gold, the image was clear and satisfying. The fraud had been unmasked, the community had seen the truth, and order had been restored.